When it comes to the issue of literature, we've already kind of mentioned a very important piece of literature from the 17th century, the development of the King James Version. Now, the King James Version, as a theological work, as a translation of Scripture into the English language, cannot be denied. It is very significant and has a very significant impact on the theology of Christianity, especially the English-speaking Protestants. But it's also a pretty good literary achievement, even separate from it being the Scriptures. Developed by a committee of 54 translators, it has been looked upon as one of the pinnacles of English literary achievement, and perhaps one of the best things ever to come out of a committee. So we shouldn't deny that it is a premier example of literature in this time period. But there are other examples that we can point to as well. Talk about two prominent ones with religious themes at their heart. One of them is the author and poet John Milton. He was the son of a Protestant composer who was also named John Milton, studied languages, traveled in Europe, eventually decides to prepare to be an Anglican priest, studies at Cambridge, graduates in 1632, but he will later abandon his desire to be a priest. While at Cambridge, he begins writing poetry, which will, of course, be the significant mark that Milton leaves on English society and the West. He's very active in speaking out during the English Civil War, particularly against Anglicanism, the Anglican form of church governance. Remember, a lot of Parliament, which is revolting against the king, is Puritan. So they have this denial of Anglican government. And so he becomes very supportive of Oliver Cromwell, becomes very supportive of Puritanism, even though he's not a very traditional Orthodox Puritan. Eventually he becomes a governmental secretary. Due to his work as well, he goes blind. And it is from that, even though he's blind, he continues to create poetry and becomes very effective in his later life. When Charles II becomes king, he manages to lose his position. He's imprisoned, but he does not lose his life. Eventually he is freed from his imprisonment. The work that Milton is best known for, although there are others, is Paradise Lost, which was published in 1667. Paradise Lost is written in blank verse. It doesn't rhyme. And is an account of the fall of Adam and Eve, and an investigation and attempt to make sense of God's providence. Paradise Lost, of course, has a very Christian subject and a lot of Christian biblical references, but he also has a lot of classical references in there as well. For example, he starts off by calling a muse to help him tell his tale. Paradise Lost becomes very influential, and often a lot of how Western Christians from the 17th century to the present, a lot of how they think about hell and how they think about Satan is influenced not as much from the Bible as it is from Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. The whole notion of Satan reigning in hell comes from Paradise Lost. It does not come from the Bible. But one of the first things that Satan says as he's cast down is that it is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And that kind of notion sticks in the Christian mindset that Satan rules hell. Well, that's not necessarily biblical. In fact, Satan is kind of almost the hero of Paradise Lost. We might call him more of an anti-hero, really, than the hero. But he's a prominent figure, very well presented, very well developed in Paradise Lost. The general plot line of Paradise Lost is starts off in the aftermath of a war in heaven when Satan and his angels have been cast out. Satan plans to get back at God, but not through going back to heaven, but instead getting at human beings on earth. He makes several attempts to secretly convince Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree, but eventually, of course, appears as the serpent and convinces her to eat. Adam is also persuaded to eat, and then the Son of God appears in order to judge Adam and Eve. So thematically follows, of course, the biblical story. At the end of Paradise Lost, the last two books of it, the Archangel Michael takes Adam to a high mountain and kind of shows him biblical history, the things that are going to take place leading up to the work of Christ, but then also the end of time, the last judgment. Milton himself may not have been strictly Orthodox. There are some instances where people say it appears that he denied the notion of the Trinity, that he thought of Jesus as a created being, as opposed to someone that was always eternal. But it's also important because of his push for religious freedom and tolerance, which will, with John Locke, be very influential. Another very prominent author of the time, also from England, is John Bunyan. Known best for his work, Pilgrim's Progress. The full title is The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come. It's been translated into several hundred languages and has never been out of print, which is a pretty monumental task, especially for a work from the 1600s. Bunyan grew up Puritan, served in Parliament's army during the Civil War, but consistently in his life, especially in his adulthood, was troubled by feelings of guilt and this continued weight of his own sin. Eventually, he joins a Baptist church where he begins preaching. But due to his preaching without a license from the Anglican hierarchy, he was imprisoned in the latter part of the 17th century, at one point for 12 years. Pilgrim's Progress is kind of presented as a dream Milton has, which is the pilgrimage of a character named Christian from the city of destruction through a variety of places, the Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair, and the Delectable Mountains, before arriving at the Celestial City. On this task, Christian meets a variety of characters. His companions are faithful and hopeful. That's their names, not their characteristics. And he encounters characters named Mr. Worldly Wiseman, Lord Hategood, Mr. Standfast, and Mr. Valiant for Truth. Right? So very thinly veiled allegory. Right? So it's very symbolic of what's going on here. It's symbols of the Christian life, the various things Christians will face in their walk with God, which is probably why it has made it so popular throughout the centuries and why people have continued to turn to it as a piece of devotional literature. Ultimately emphasizing things like the importance of letting go of one's sin, to not be distracted by various things, people, and places, and focus on heaven. Bunyan and Milton and others we've talked about evidence another important cultural development of the times, and that is the rise of Puritanism. Here too, as in other cases, it's difficult to know exactly where to place Puritanism. Should we look at it as a political movement, which it certainly was? Should we look at it as a doctrinal movement, which it certainly was? But there are a lot of things related to how Puritans view culture and society around them that I think are important. If you remember back to the time period of the Reformation, we talked about the Marian exiles, and we talked a little bit about this on Monday as well. People who had fled England, Protestants who had fled England during the reign of Mary Tudor. They returned to England under her half-sister Elizabeth, with the assumption that Elizabeth is going to continue the reforms that Henry and Edward had established. And so they thought that here would be a time where, first of all, the Catholic Church would be completely out of power, but that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, would continue to reform to look more and more what they thought the church should look like. But as these people returned, these Marian exiles, they found themselves mocked instead of finding themselves in positions of influence, largely because they had very strict interpretations of the Bible. They were very literalist about their interpretation. And of course they have been to Geneva, and they've been influenced by Calvin. And so they have very strict interpretations of the Bible, and they have very strict notions of morality. And not everybody agreed with them about what Christians could and couldn't do. Elizabeth had returned to some reforms, but didn't reform all the things that these people wanted. Eventually, people started mocking them by calling them precisionists, that they were wanting precision in doctrine, or sometimes Puritans. One example of an area where Elizabeth didn't reform had to do with clerical dress. Elizabeth required all clergy, all priests, to wear a white ceremonial robe with big sleeves while they were performing at worship, while they were presiding at worship. And the Puritans thought, this is something from Catholicism. This is not something from Scripture. They wanted the minister to just dress in plain dress. And so here is this conflict that arises because they thought Elizabeth would reform. Elizabeth doesn't reform the way that they would like. Furthermore, Elizabeth is very strict about this because for Elizabeth, any sort of religious dissidence will lead to political dissidence. And so she wants all priests, ministers to do the same things in the same ways. We, of course, talked about the persecution that Puritans faced under James I and Charles I, books being banned, sometimes burnt, imprisonment. Sometimes Puritans even had their ears cut off because of the ways that they challenged the church, and by the church, then the monarch. But in thinking about the relationship of church to society, Puritans essentially had two views. They're thinking about how do we relate to the society around us. And essentially there are two different types. Some people, which we can call separatists, believed that the Church of England would not change. And so they needed to leave the Church of England. They needed to abandon the Church of England. And so the antagonism that they felt from the church, from other Christians, from the government, they said, let's just separate. The other group was non-separatists, okay? Sometimes referred to as pragmatists. These are not necessarily names they refer to themselves, but approaches that they were taking. And they believed that reform in the church could take place. And so they decided to stay in the Church of England, with the hope, the assumption, that eventually the reforms that they wanted to see would take place if they continued to be in the church. In 1608, due to the persecution that Puritans were facing from James I, they fled to Holland, the Netherlands. As I mentioned, of course, on Monday, the Dutch, very tolerant religiously, and so this separatist group of Puritans immigrate there. But not only were religions tolerated, a lot of other things were tolerated in Holland as well. And so the Puritans feel there's too much immorality going on in Holland, And so they're concerned. We raise our children here. What are our children going to encounter? What are they going to be drawn away from and enticed? And so they decide to travel to the English colonies in North America. The Pilgrims. Small group travels on the Mayflower in 1620, originally intended to go to Virginia, but end up in New England. Now we think of the Pilgrims as Puritans, but really, the group that travels on the Mayflower is 35 separatists, and most of the other people are adventurers. Right? They're going out to make their way, make money, members of the Church of England. Right? So it's not like everybody on this boat is Puritan. Half of them died. There were other challenges that they faced in Plymouth Plantation, and eventually the settlement was absorbed into the larger settlement in Massachusetts Bay. So the separatists, the non-separatists, of course, believing they can reform from within, eventually face persecution, and they too decide, we're going to the colonies. This group attains a royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. What's interesting in their charter is that all of the colonial charters given by the king had a clause in there that required, like, you know, the East India Company or something like that, you had to keep an office in England in order to get the charter. But their charter did not include that. And so a sizable group of non-separatist Puritans go to Massachusetts Bay. In the early years, as they start, 1630s when they arrive in Massachusetts, they start off with this hope that they will be a city on a hill. Right? So drawing from Matthew 5, this idea of we are going to be an example to England. We're going to go to the colonies, we're going to establish our society, we're going to run it the way we think it should be run, the church is going to be run the way we think it should be run. England is going to take notice and say, they're right, we need to reform. Nobody notices that this is working. And we'll talk about some of the challenges, right? So it doesn't happen that way. But it seems like a lot of those early colonists thought that at some point they would return to England and be welcomed with open arms. Now, most colonies, like Jamestown at this time, percentage-wise, had more young, unmarried men focused on profit. Massachusetts Bay, however, is different because a lot of people are going in families. And those families are interested in settlement, constructing a stable society, and so the colony in Massachusetts Bay looked quite different than something like Jamestown.